A wise man once said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." If we're more divided than we've been at any time in the last 100 years or so, we better start shoring up the foundations of our democracy before this house falls in on us. Most Americans, according to polls, are getting pretty fed up with all the anger and hostility and insults they're bombarded with on a daily basis from the news, from politics, from social media. This rising incivility is wearing us down emotionally and is tearing us up into hostile camps that can't even talk to each other anymore. Political science, which is kind of my jam, tells us we're more divided as a country than at any point since maybe Reconstruction. Most Republicans and Democrats think members of the other party are a bigger threat to America than anything else. More parents would be upset if their kids married somebody from the other political party than somebody from a different race or religion. Nobody wants that around their table at Thanksgiving. My name is Carl Luna. I'm dedicated to working with you to help rebuild civility. Now, civility is not just politeness. The antebellum South was a bastion of politeness, but it masked the abomination of slavery. Civility is that which brings us together, gives us a sense of common identity. It's e pluribus unum. Civility is also speaking truth to power. It's establishing justice and inclusivity and respect for everyone. Incivility is the other stuff, the stuff that divides us, tears us apart. Incivility breaks down e pluribus unum. This program is dedicated to holding civil discussions about often divisive issues. The goal of this program is to hold fact-based inquiry to try to reach common ground on the sorts of issues that can divide us as a community. Ours is a voyage of civil discovery. Along the way, we hope to learn something about San Diego and ourselves and maybe even have a little fun. All the while trying to keep it civil, San Diego. Our goal is to relearn how to talk to each other and not just at each other and over each other, to try to put the we back into we the people. And never forget, in our Constitution, we the people means basically ohana, family, where no one gets left behind and no one gets forgotten. One of the big measures of how civil we are as a community is how we treat our most vulnerable, our children. San Diego is a beautiful city, but we have an ugly problem in human trafficking, particularly in minors. We recently spoke with experts and community leaders about this terrible blight on our community civility. We're talking about human trafficking, sex trafficking, child abuse. What are the sort of people that get sucked into this web of trafficking?
Well, we're talking about San Diego, and Dr. Amy Carpenter, working with a professor at Point Loma Nazarene named Jamie Gates, they estimated that the average age of a person who's a victim in sex trafficking, it's about 16 years of age. They estimated that the size of the illicit trade and sex trade is about $800 million per year. So we can guess that's a lot higher today.
And that's just in San Diego?
That's just in San Diego.
Does San Diego's proximity as a border community, a major trading center, play into that more than maybe in other areas?
It could, but one of the things that this study uncovered is that most of the victims of sex trafficking in San Diego are actually American citizens.
Yeah, many people compartmentalize problems. It's somebody else's problems. What communities in San Diego need to be concerned about this?
All communities in San Diego need to be concerned about this. I mean, human trafficking is not just a problem of policymakers or nonprofits who are working with, survivors of human trafficking. It is everybody's problem.
Regarding children, in San Diego, we've gotten much greater awareness over the last 10 years or so about the issue. And this is an issue of violence against children. This is an issue of victimization of individuals who oftentimes don't recognize themselves as victims. It's very insidious, the way that children are brought into the world of sexual exploitation. We know that kids are recruited from school. We know there's a lot of recruitment from foster care. So this is a really significant issue regarding violence against children. And so I think it takes a community, it takes adults who want a civil society who want a society that's based on recognizing the needs of the most vulnerable to really decide to mobilize around eradicating this issue.
It's a real reminder that we need to think about the most vulnerable in our society and that our government is supposed to be protecting those individuals as opposed to the more influential special interests that they tend to cater to in government politics. I think San Diego is really unique in that we have task forces of people from law enforcement and prosecutors and service providers already working together collaboratively, so we have a unique opportunity in this community to be moving the needle on this.
San Diego District Attorney Summer Stephan has made protecting the most vulnerable in our community, our children, a centerpiece of her time in office. I spoke with her recently at the University of San Diego's Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice. I'd like to welcome District Attorney Summer Stephan to our taping of Keep It Civil San Diego. We appreciate you being here tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here because this is an issue that I know you're passionate about. One of the ways we conceptualize civility in our institute is ohana. It means family. Nobody gets left behind or forgotten. Civility is building community. How good a job are we doing in San Diego building community that includes all of our children and protects them?
Well, I think you're so right. We can't talk about civility without protecting the most vulnerable, and that's our children, our disabled, our seniors, and we are fighting hard for them, but we can do more. We can do more every day here in San Diego County. There are kids that are being harmed by sexual abuse, by bullying, by physical abuse, and this trauma stays with them, and really what is stunning is that most of them don't ever report it. They just hold it inside and it becomes a part of their lifelong trauma. And so it's really important that we open avenues like discussion here today about abuse so people feel a freedom to report and to be respected.
Now let's talk about how big a problem this is and why it's a perpetuating problem. I mean, the numbers are staggering. The thousands of children every year in San Diego and across the nation, it's in the tens of thousands. How can you communicate that sense of the enormity of the problem to the San Diego community?
Well, right now in San Diego County, in my office, which is the People's Prosecutor, the San Diego District Attorney's Office, we have 492 cases involving horrific sexual abuse of children, sexual abuse of adults, human trafficking. These are atrocious cases of kids being abused. The problem is that people have stereotypes of what that looks like. And they're thinking of some stranger jumping out of the bushes and kidnapping these kids. And they're thinking it's rare because those cases make the headlines, but they're not every day. But every day you have kids being sold in hotel rooms across this county, kids being bought like a slice of pizza over the internet to strange men coming in and buying them for sex. There are, unfortunately, family members walking in on 8-year-olds with their teddy bear sleeping next to them and molesting those kids. You've got a college young girl going to her first party and she's unconscious because she drank too much, and sexual abuse is happening to this unconscious girl. This is happening all around us, but it is mostly silent. It is not in the headlines, and it isn't exactly how people imagine that it happens or imagine how the victim reacts to it.
And you've talked about sex trafficking in San Diego as one of our largest illegal industries. I think, what would you say, it's only after drug dealing for human trafficking. Given that, if I've read correctly, the average age for a person entering into human trafficking is like 14 or 12, is there any real distinction really between the human trafficking cycle and child abuse?
You know, it's amazing that you're the first to ask this question, because people somehow think that if you buy a child for sex and you pay money for it, that it is now going to be labeled as prostitution as opposed to sexual abuse of a child, which is what it is. Just because you pay $1 for it, which is what makes it human trafficking, the only difference for human trafficking is that it's for commercial profit. So you're sexually abusing this child, but you're doing it for a commercial profit. There's money attached, which in most reasonable people's mind makes it worse. It makes it child abuse on steroids, because you're now bringing in a cartel and an organized crime industry in addition to the abuse of the child. So that is what it is. You're absolutely right. There is not a difference other than it's child abuse on steroids.
Do our laws recognize that? Do they bring the two together, or do they kind of separate it off that, well, this is human trafficking, it goes in that direction, child abuse goes in that direction? Do we have a unified approach to dealing with this?
Well, only recently. It's amazing that this obvious problem and the fact that it is child sexual abuse took such a long time to label correctly. It wasn't until the year 2016 that the sexual exploitation of a child became a mandated reporting crime. So it was added to the child abuse list of crimes you must report as a mandated reporter. It would seem obvious, but for some reason, people were stuck on that somehow this is a child's choice to sell their body for sex. It's really, I mean, it's almost madness, because what child, what boy or girl grows up saying, you know, what I dream of being is a prostitute? It is absolutely not the truth. This is a decision made for them. They are being coerced, the duress is being applied to them to put them into human trafficking, which is the second largest criminal industry. It is an $810 million criminal industry right here in beautiful San Diego County.
That's $1 billion industry almost. Is that part of the problem? There's so much money involved with it that people look the other way because that money has to go somewhere. So somebody is processing it, moving it through the system. Does that get in the way of trying to deal with this?
Well, I think two things get in the way. One is the money and the fact that it can really operate on this high level, this organized crime level, where the traffickers are psychologically deceiving these kids. They almost have degrees in deception. They use the social media to psychologically kidnap our kids right out of the privacy of their bedroom and coerce them into this life. But the second problem is that as a society, we've sort of accepted the buying of people for sex. We've glamorized it with movies like Pretty Woman and The Client List. So we have to kind of smash that whole illusion that we developed, and that's hard for our society. But to really defeat human trafficking, we must do that.
And how does that apply, like with federal RICO laws and the rest? I mean, again, the money that comes changing hands in a motel room or a hotel room over the internet, at some point that ends up in a bank account. How do you crack down on that end of things to take the air out of the room so they can deal with the problem itself?
Well, we work on human trafficking in a task force that's organized, that has a money laundering angle. It has a very sophisticated collaboration of law enforcement, because you're right, we have to cut it out from its root. It's a money-making industry. So we have to attack it from the strong prosecution end, but also deal with all of its tentacles in terms of the money that it produces. But that by itself is still not going to be enough, because the more that law enforcement adapts to learn how to bring down these organizations, these criminal organizations, because of the profit, the criminal organizations learn on how to get around it. We bring down one platform, one social media platform like Backpage, and they start creating other ones because it is so lucrative. So we have to not only do the prosecution, which we must do, and continue to dedicate resources to it, we have to attack it from a prevention point of view also, which prevention is something that people don't want to pay for. But prevention is very important. It's the ability to teach our kids the truth of what are the harms that may come their way. And if you look around in educational institutions everywhere in schools, we're still stuck on the stranger danger. And the stranger danger to kids is only 10% of the cases. 90% of the harm happening to our kids is from people in their circle of trust or people who enter their circle of trust specifically to lure them into harm's way.
Now, there's so much to unpack with all that. You begin with the idea of having to report things when these things come up. How does this cycle of putting things under the rug perpetuate itself, that victims end up not being able to come forward, and when they do, they're not believed?
It's so true. It is very, very difficult. Our society really judges crimes that involve sexual crimes very differently than other crimes. If you have somebody who is, has their security alarm off and their door unlocked and somebody burglarizes them, no one judges them. They don't say, oh, he deserved to be burglarized because he didn't have his car door or his home locked. But when a child or an adult is sexually abused, the first thing we do is we turn to blame that child or that adult. Why didn't you report right away? Why didn't you fight? Why didn't you push off the person? Why didn't you do this or that? Instead of judging the perpetrator and the acts of the perpetrator. So it makes it very hard for people to report. They feel the judgment and they see that there are questions being asked about them, so the next victim doesn't comfortably come forward. And that's very important that we break that down, that victims know that they're gonna be believed and that it is not their fault. There's only one person to blame, and that's the predator who did what they did.
And they're a predator. But in an age of Epstein and Weinstein and #MeToo, how do you change that paradigm? Because, under our system of law, innocent until proven guilty, the victim is just part of the process. But how do you give, particularly for the child, give the child the justice they need to protect them if the system tends to be looking the other way?
Well, you do what we did in San Diego, which is to create new systems. We created a specialized unit for child abuse, for sexual assault, and for human trafficking, so that the system is there set up with the expertise not to ask those types of questions that show judgment and show that you really have complete ignorance about how sexual assault and abuse happens. With trauma-informed victim advocates and a team that is there to actually bring out the truth and to fight for that victim. You create those systems. I realized years ago that we did not have the systems. We had systems to fight a robbery case on videotape and other types of cases, but we didn't have the systems set up. So we created our own kind of like law and order special victims units that specifically address this harm and that can competently prosecute those cases. The results are, they're not statistical, they're real. They're victims like one of the victims I had who was molested by her neighbor as her mom was going through chemotherapy. Again, someone in a position of trust. So what did this child do? She didn't tell anyone. She didn't want to add to the burden of her mom going through chemotherapy. She kept it inside. And then when she became a teenager, that's when she became rebellious and didn't want to go by the rules. Why? Because the rules all failed her. So what did our system do? They looked at her as the person who's making up things. And when she finally told the truth and we were able to prosecute this case, the results are hard to measure. They're the thing that drives me day after day. When I was elected, I received a card. This is 20 years later, because I've been in this for 3 decades. And it had a picture of a young woman with 2 children and a husband And the card basically said, you gave me this life because you fought for me and you brought about justice. So building these justice systems are generational. They're not just for that victim, but for the generations that come after that victim to have dignity, civility, and respect.
Now, I've read that our funding for child protection actually hasn't recovered to the 2008 level before the Great Recession statewide. I mean, you brought up the point that a lot of people like to think that's other people's problems, happens in other zip codes, when the reality is almost every high school you've studied has incidents like this. It's a north, south, east, west problem in San Diego. Mm-hmm. How do we build the empathy across our different communities to understand this affects everybody, that you cannot just say it's other people's problems? How do you get over NIMBYism that says we don't want a halfway house for battered women in our neighborhood? We don't want a halfway house for victims of sex trafficking, like you saw as a big argument in Coronado not too recently. What's the challenge of getting the money you need? Because I know you need a lot more money to deal with this than the state can provide.
You're so right, and we've been stuck, because the expenditure on a 911 reaction is there, but there isn't this actual expenditure first to provide the right protection for victims and to also provide the right funding for prevention before people become victims. So we like to react, but we don't like to be proactive in how we care for victims of crime, and that's something that we really must address urgently. I know that recently Children's Hospital had a waiting list for kids that were suffering from trauma, and we had to fight for funding to make sure that we get that trauma-informed care for the kids. It's so important. But there is an attitude like, this can't happen here. This place is so beautiful with the oceans and everything. It can't happen in my family. But the reality is no one is immune, because these crimes and human trafficking, as one example of it thrives in vulnerability. And people immediately associate vulnerability with socioeconomic status, with poverty. Yes, that's one vulnerability, but vulnerability also exists in kids who have learning disabilities, kids who feel bullied in school, and they can live in any zip code. They can feel that loneliness, so that the predators are reaching out through the social media and trying to befriend them and trying to fill that vulnerability void and pull them into a life of destruction and harm and really death. So no one is immune. I've seen police officers' family that were trapped in human trafficking, teachers, nurses. There is just every segment of society. These are our children, really, is the way we have to look at society, at civility, is that if we feel that these are our children, then we will really care.
There was a wise man who once said that however you treat the least of my children, my brethren, you treat me. We seem to forget that from time to time. I mean, every time there's a Comic-Con, there's a Super Bowl, there's a major event, there's a lot more going on in those hotels than just simple partying. The holidays are going to be coming up. If you could ask for something in your stocking to help to fund this, how much more money, how much more real support do you think we have to commit as a city, as a state, to show we're really serious about this issue?
Well, we need housing. We need to make sure, because we see that when we do recover victims, they've lost their innocence. They've lost so much of their life, the building pieces. I look in the eyes of this 13-year-old victim who, she was one of the few that actually got the care that she needed, and now she's completing a master's and can be that next generation that is not broken. She can break that chain from her family and family abuse to provide her children with a whole person that can help her children. This investment is really important, but let's not forget the investment of time. One of the things that anybody can do is to be a mentor. If we think of these children, these people that have been harmed like that, as part of our family, and we provide them with mentorship. That's why things like Voices for Children, Boys and Girls Club, being a mentor has been proven to be a lifesaver. So we need the investment of money in systems, in actual trauma-specific care for kids who are suffering PTSD and trauma, and we need that, but we also just need the human touch of a mentor, of a friend, to understand what a normal relationship looks like, where somebody doesn't want something from you, but actually cares for
So
you.
what we're saying is it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of time, and we all have got to keep it civil.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, District Attorney Summer Stephan.
Thank you.
San Diegans need to practice holding difficult conversations about divisive issues and do it in a civil way. That's what this program is dedicated to helping us try to achieve. We'll work on this in the weeks ahead together, but until then, keep it civil, San Diego.